Hello, everyone. Charlie Bilello here. Welcome to Words of Wisdom, a new show where I'm going to break down on every episode a different quote and tell you how to apply it on your own investing journey. So I want to start in the first episode with the great Charlie Munger, who said the first rule of compounding is to never interrupt it unnecessarily. And before we dig into what Charlie was talking about here, I want to talk about the concept of compounding and the power of it. We have to talk about the difference between simple interest and compound interest. So basically, compound interest is taking the interest that you get or the dividend or the gain and reinvesting it. And simple interest is taking that gain and putting it somewhere else that isn't earning a return. So if we start out with $10,000 in year one and we're earning 10% on that, so we make $1,000 in interest. In the simple interest example, we take that $1,000 and we put it into a checking account or somewhere where it's not earning any money. And so at the start of year two, we have that same $10,000 earning that same 10%. So it's static in terms of what you're making. It's $1,000 per year. Now, in the compound interest example, you're taking that $1,000, reinvesting it. And so at the start of year two, you have $11,000. And now that 10% gain on that is going to be $1,100. So that grows over time because you keep reinvesting that gain. And at the end of year four, what you're left with is $14,000 if we're talking about simple interest. So simply the four $1,000 interest payments. But if we're talking about compound interest, you're left with $14,641. So $641 more because of this concept of compound interest. Now, that probably doesn't seem like very much, but if you go out in time and you really compound this, it tends to increase very widely in the later years. And here's an example here talking about that same $10,000 investment earning 10% per year. If we go out 30 years with simple interest, you're left with $40,000. So you have that $1,000 a year gain times 30 years. You add that to your original 10,000, you get 40,000. But if we're talking about compound interest and you're reinvesting that, you're left with $198,374. So huge increase. You can see here the curve is exponential. So as time goes on, this spread is widening more and more. And I think a great example of this would be with looking at Warren Buffett, longtime partner of Charlie Munger. When he was 65 years old, he was worth $3 billion. And what a lot of people probably don't know about Warren Buffett is that close to 98% of his current net worth of $138 billion came after his 65th birthday. So when most people retire, he has $3 billion, obviously a huge sum, but today $138 billion. And that's all due to compounding in terms of his net worth in Berkshire Hathaway stock. So unbelievable example here of the power of compounding. Now, how do people interrupt that compounding unnecessarily? I think there's two primary examples that we should talk about. Number one would be during periods of fear, during periods of panic. That tends to happen during bear markets. And I think a great example of this would be the last 10 years, where you say, if you just looked at today and you said the S&P 500 was up 236% in the last 10 years, you'd say, that's amazing. 12.8% per year annualized, well above the historical 10% a year that the S&P 500 has delivered. The only problem is you had to stick with it. You couldn't have interrupted that compounding. And what many people did in 2020 is they interrupted it because they were worried about COVID, about a Great Depression coming, about further stock market decline. So a lot of people, if you looked at the flows in terms of funds, took money out of the market back then. And had you done so, your 10-year return is not going to be 236%. It's going to be stuck at that 35% where we were at the COVID lows. And that's only 3.1% annualized. So this is one example. Another example would be the other direction. So it's not always a fear because there's a bear market that people are taking money out. People also have a fear when things are running up very fast. And I think a great example of this would be after the March 2009 lows. So we had this huge bear market, worst bear market since the Great Depression, S&P 500 down well over 50%. March 9th, 2009, stock market's bottoms, and it races higher over the next 5 years. It would more than triple, up 209%. If you look at the headlines around that point in time in March 2014, what many people were saying is this is too much. This is too fast. You should take your money out and lock in the gains while you have them. That ended up being a very poor decision. If we look at the full 10-year period here, March 9th, 2019, S&P 500 total return is 400% here. So 17.5% annualized by doing nothing, just buying and holding. And had you gotten out after 5 years because you thought it was too much, your return's only going to be 11.9% annualized. Now, here's the question. Is there ever a reason to interrupt compounding? Great question. I think the answer is definitely yes. Sometimes you need to. You have an emergency expense. You might have lost your job or your income. You might be in retirement and have to start withdrawing from your IRA or 401k. And lastly, perhaps you've amassed so much money that you're not going to need a lot of this and you want to start enjoying your wealth and you want to start taking big family vacations. Those are all reasons why you could have to interrupt compounding, and these are all valid reasons. Now, if you can take money from elsewhere, in terms of you have money sitting in a savings account or a checking account, you definitely would want to take it from there first. But sometimes you need to sell, and I think these are valid reasons to do so. What's an unnecessary interruption of compounding? What was Charlie Munger talking about? Well, number one would be behavioral. So our emotions, fear, we're afraid, and usually it's during a bear market. It's usually when the news is negative. We're afraid that the market's never going to come back, and we just want to get out of everything, sell everything, and go into something like a checking account. Not a good reason to get out. Market timing would be another thing that you don't want to do because the odds are against you. Most people don't successfully time the market. And also, if you have money in a taxable account, it's not a very tax efficient strategy because you're turning long-term gains into short-term gains. Not exactly a successful strategy. And finally, crash and recession predictions. This is something that's huge. If you're watching the media, you're watching the daily news, there's always somebody predicting a recession or a crash. And of course, eventually they will be right because there's going to be another crash. There's going to be another recession. We just don't know when. But listening to these types of predictions, not good in the long run because these people are most often wrong and they don't have the same time frame as you oftentimes. If you have 20, 30 years, if there is a crash, if there is a recession and the market goes down and you're still adding to your 401k, adding to your IRA, well, that's actually an opportunity to buy more, not to interrupt the compounding that has already taken place. So we're not Warren Buffett. We're not talking about billions here, but with a little bit of effort, a little bit of savings, you can really see the growth here in compounding over time. Average growth of a $100,000 portfolio over time. If we're looking at a 5-year period, 172,000, you're left with 10 years, 303,000. If we fast forward all the way to 30 years, if you could stick in the market for 30 years, your average increase in terms of starting with $100,000 is to 2.5 million. So power of compounding really illustrated here if you don't interrupt it, as Charlie Munger said, unnecessarily. So thank you for joining me for the first episode of Words of Wisdom. Hit that subscribe button if you're watching this on YouTube, and I'll see you next time on Words of Wisdom, episode 2.